Welcome to Real Railroads Episode 3. This episode I will be talking about forming the Class 1s of North America. This will be Part 1. There will either be Part 2 and 3 or Part 2, depending on how long the Part 2 takes. Today we only have 7 Class 1 railroads. CSX Transportation, Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific, BNSF Railway, Kansas City Southern, Canadian Pacific, and Canadian National. You can probably hear how hard it is raining. You'll probably hear thunder from time to time. The largest 6 of those, CP, CN, CSXT, NS, UP, and BNSF, are created from many fallen flag Class 1 railroads and some Class 2 railroads. The North American railroad map has changed drastically over the years, and only a small fraction are represented in the model railroading world. There still are a lot more railroads that aren't modeled, and I will get to a few of those eventually. We will start with the KCS mergers. The first major merger for them was in 1939 when the Kansas City Southern Railway Company acquired the Louisiana and Arkansas Railway, which added the route between Dallas and New Orleans via Shreveport. The next merger was on January 1st, 1994. This was the acquisition of Mid-South Rail, which added 1,212 miles of mostly ICG trackage that is today known as the Meridian Speedway, a high-volume freight racetrack that would give any larger railroad a massive advantage over any other railroad. In 1996, the KCS paid 49% of a $1.4 billion concession to operate 2,261 miles of foreign Mexican government trackage in Mexico. This trackage became known as, and I'll probably butcher this name, Grupo Transportación Ferroviaria Mexicana, and included partial control of the Texas Mexican Railway, which owns the Texas Mexican Railway International Bridge in Laredo, Texas. TM also is larger than that, but that's the main thing. TM and TFM remained subsidiaries for several years. TM, also known as Tex-Mex, still exists as a subsidiary. These two were followed by the 1997 purchase of 408-mile Class 2 railroad Gateway Western Railway and its subsidiary, 17-mile Gateway Eastern Railway. Another acquisition came on June 19, 1998, when the government of Panama turned over control of the Panama Canal Railway to the KCS and Lanigan Holdings LLC, which changed the name to the Panama Canal Railway Company. The next merger happened when KCS formally absorbed Gateway Western into the KCS on October 1st, 2001. The GWWR's, the subsidiary Gateway Eastern, GWWE, in Illinois, remains a KCS subsidiary today. The final merger came on January 1st, 2005, when KCS purchased the other 51% of TFM and renamed the Mexican subsidiary Kansas City Southern de Mexico SADCV, or KCSM. The fate of KCS remains up in the air as they have rejected a purchase offer in September 2020, and then in March 2021 were offered $25 to $29 billion by Canadian Pacific, which was followed by a superior offer from Canadian National in May. Currently, the Canadian National bid has been accepted and is awaiting approval, while a second CP offer, which might have a better chance, sits. Now we'll go to CSX Transportation. This 21,000-mile railroad has existed since July 1st, 1986. Formed from the mergers of one company and 4 semi-independent railroads, but not including the acquisition of Conrail on June 1st, 1999. But let's start with at the beginning of the events that led to CSX Transportation. This was 1886, when the Central of Georgia and Louisville-Nashville jointly leased the Atlanta and West Point. The next event came on January 1st, 1900, when 3 Michigan railroads merged. These were the Flint and Pierre Marquette, Detroit, Grand Rapids, and Western, and the Chicago and West Michigan into the Pierre Marquette Railroad. It was an independent railroad until the 1920s, when it came under the control of 2 brothers who also owned the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, Erie Railroad, and Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. The 4 companies were to be merged, but this was denied by the ICC, which oversaw mergers at the time. Also in 1900 was the formation of the Atlantic Coast Line and the Seaboard Airline, which would eventually become CSX. These also were out of mergers. On December 1st, 1924, the holding company Clinchfield Railroad was formed to operate the 266-mile Carolina Clinchfield and Ohio Railroad, which ran from South Carolina to Kentucky, mainly serving coal and textile industries. This was jointly controlled by the Atlantic Coast Line in Louisville and Nashville. Another ACL subsidiary was the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company that was jointly controlled by ACL and the Seaboard Airline. The banking part is now mostly Wells Fargo. The next piece of the puzzle came together in 1929 when the Baltimore, Ohio gained control of 2 railroads in New York and Pennsylvania. The 460-mile Buffalo, Rochester, and Pittsburgh, which ran through here, and the 250-mile Buffalo and Susquehanna. Both of these railroads were coal haulers. BRMP's main business was bringing coal up from Pennsylvania to the port in Rochester. The BNS was originally a lumber hauler, but they had gone to coal. The BNS today is almost completely abandoned, while the BRMP is mostly abandoned or owned, operated by GWI companies, Rochester and Southern, and Buffalo and Pittsburgh. The 2 railroads were technically subsidiaries, with these BRMP and BNS, with all rolling stock letter for Baltimore, Ohio until 1954, although the 2 really ceased to exist in 1932. The B&O had owned 98% of BRMP stock and 99% of BNS stock in 1931. Next came January 1st, 1944, when the COG sold their interest in Atlanta and West Point, but L&N did not. This was followed on June 6, 1947, when the Pierre Marquette was merged into Chesapeake and Ohio. Next, Chesapeake and Ohio gained control of the Baltimore, Ohio in 1962, followed by the B&O and C&O gaining joint control of the Western Maryland in 1967. Then came July 1st, 1967, when the Seaboard Airline and over 5,000-mile Atlantic coastline merged to form the Seaboard Coastline Railroad. This new railroad had complete control of the Georgia Railroad and partial control over the Clinchfield. On May 9, 1969, a new era of Southern railroading was formed, the holding company Seaboard Coastline Industries. This company became the owner of the over 5,000-mile Louisville-Nashville, 331-mile Georgia Railroad, 266-mile Clinchfield Railroad, and 9,809-mile Seaboard Coastline Railroad, along with Atlanta and West Point. A system of over 15,000 miles owned by one company, but operated completely independent of each other. In 1972, these railroads officially adopted a name they had long been called, Flaming Lines, and the logo of the Flaming Line system began being applied to locomotives and freight cars, despite the fact the railroads were in fact independent from each other. They were just owned by the same company. On February 26, 1973, another holding company was formed, Chessie System Incorporated. This was a parent of Chesapeake, Ohio, and its assets, Baltimore, Ohio, and Western Maryland. The Chessie System is very often incorrectly called a railroad. It in fact never was a railroad. It, like Family Line System, was a paint scheme shared by basically independent railroads. It owned no track, locomotives, or rolling stock. All equipment and trackage were owned by the B&O, C&O, and WM. These holding companies are fairly short-lived, however. On November 1st, 1980, Chessie System Incorporated and Seaboard Coastline Industries merged to form a new holding company, Chessie Seaboard Multiplied Corporation, aka CSX Corporation. The Family Line System and Chessie System names, however, continued to exist for a couple of years. On December 29, 1982, the SCL Railroad and L&N merged, forming Seaboard System Railroad. This new railroad absorbed the Georgia Railroad on December 29th to 31st, 1982, followed by the Clinchfield on January 1st, 1983. And the AWP was also absorbed at some point. I couldn't find the date that was absorbed. Also in 1983, the Western Maryland was merged into the B&O. So you have railroads that are dropping out. They're consolidating. They're becoming an empire. On July 1st, 1986, Seaboard System Railroad was renamed CSX Transportation, followed by the merging of B&O into C&O in April 1987, and then the August 31st 1987 merger of Chesapeake and Ohio into CSX Transportation. Thus, Seaboard and Chessie were no more. This new railroad then in 1991 added the approximately 100-mile bridge route Richmond-Fredericksburg and Potomac. Then in 1993 absorbed the 211-mile Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad, followed by the August 1998 to June 1st, 1999 split of Conrail, with CSX acquiring 42%. Now, CSX is a well-known railroad. I don't think there's anybody that doesn't know what CSX is. Now we'll go to a brief little thing about Conrail. Consolidated Rail Corp was formed April 1st, 1976 to save Northeastern railroads, which were going or had gone bankrupt. The main reason for this company was the failure of the February 1st, 1968 merger of Pennsylvania and New York Central, which almost destroyed Northeast rail service. This company was a result of the merger of Penn Central, Transportation Company, Erie-Lackawanna Railway, Ann Arbor Railway, Lehigh Valley Railroad, Reading Company, Central Railroad in New Jersey, Lehigh and Hudson River Railway, and Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Lines. Now, Ann Arbor was included in Conrail, but it was spun off. They sold it off. They didn't want it, and it became an independent railroad, and it's now owned by, I can't think of the name of the company that owns it. So that's not gone. That's still a railroad. It's not the size it was, but it's still there. Conrail is pretty much either loved or hated. The older guys in the Northeast who remember the railroads before April 1st, 1976 tend to hate the fact that Conrail put an end to the variety in the Northeast, which they did. Others love it for its blue paint, Sparky, and that it was the most recognized face of railroading in the East Coast. It quickly started abandoning lines because it was a government railroad. It was not as limited by the regulations placed on private companies. These regulations were further lifted in 1982 when the Staggers Act was passed, and Conrail started making money. It was privatized in 1987. Conrail abandoned a lot of duplicate trackage, which, while was a smart business move, it upset some people. Many short lines exist today because of the lines cast off by Conrail during the 80s and 90s. But the formation of Conrail all but eliminated competition in the Northeast. It was in fact planned for a chunk of the area of Lackawanna to be sold to Chessie to maintain competition, especially in New York where the Chessie Systems holding didn't have much in the way to compete with Conrail. They were going to sell from New Jersey through Ohio. That would have been the Southern Tier line all the way up from Port Jervis, New Jersey, through Binghamton, Corning, to Hornell, and then the Meadville line would most likely be what they would have sold off, going across to Olean and stuff, which didn't happen. After this, the decision was made to grant Delaware and Hudson trackage rights on several Conrail lines to maintain competition. The final acquisition was the Cohauler Monongahela Railway on May 1st, 1993. In 1997, a deal for the split of 11,000-mile Conrail was reached. The purchase was finalized on August 22nd, 1998, with CSX getting 42% and Norfolk Southern getting 58%. CSX NS operations of Conrail lines began on June 1st, 1999, with the exception of 3 operations: North Jersey, South Jersey, Philly, and Detroit. These are operated by Conrail Share Assets Operations, a jointly owned railroad that performs terminal switching operations where complete control by either railroad would cause an imbalance. CASO does not have its own locomotives. It uses CSX and NS power. Now we'll go to the Southern Railway. Was formed by merger in 1894. This was with the Richmond, York River and Chesapeake Railroad, Richmond and Danville Railroad, Memphis and Charleston Railroad, and East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. This merger brought the Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Texas Pacific Railroad as a subsidiary of Southern Railway. The next acquisition for the Southern Railway was in 1895 when it financed the reorganization of what became the Georgia Southern and Florida, a 454-mile Class I railroad. This was followed in 1897 by control of the 120-mile 3-foot narrow-gauge Carolina Northwestern Railway, the largest narrow-gauge route in the Carolinas. This was eventually standard gauge, the reverse of many southern predecessors, which started as 5-foot broad gauge. The next purchase was the Severn and Knoxville Railroad in 1899. This little railroad dried up and was abandoned in 1933. Another purchase followed in 1916. This was the New Orleans Northeastern Railway, the NUN, and ONE. 196 mile Class 1. In 1940, the Southern fully absorbed the former narrow-gauge Carolina Northwestern Railway. This was followed by the 1952 purchase of the 15-mile short line Louisiana Southern Railway. Now that was short, but it was important, so I put it in there. In December 1959, the Cohauler Virginia was merged into the Norfolk and Western Railway. This is the first thing we see of Norfolk and Western. Most of this is Southern. On June 17, 1963, the Southern acquired another subsidiary, 1,729-mile Class I Central of Georgia Railway, and a subsidiary, Savannah Atlanta Railway and Wrightsville and Tenniel Railroad. The next acquisition was not by the Southern Railway, but its competition. In 1964, the Norfolk and Western Railway merged the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, a.k.a. Nickel Plate Road, into itself, adding 2,170 miles to its system and becoming a major force in southern commerce by accessing Chicago and Buffalo. The Nickel Plate ran from Buffalo right along Lake Erie and across to Chicago. That's now NS, and it's the line across from the Northeast Rail Camp. There's the CSX, and then beyond it is the former Nickel Plate. They also acquired 2,423-mile Wabash Railroad the same year as a subsidiary and would keep it as such for almost 20 years. They also got control of the Erie Lackawanna and the Delaware and Hudson for a time. These actions in Norfolk and Western were met by Southern with the 1966 purchases of 35-mile Albany and Northern Railway, a logging road, Georgia Northern Railway, and its logging subsidiary, Georgia Ashburn, Sylvester, and Camilla Railway. Southern immediately merged with GAS&C into the Georgia Northern, reducing the amount of paper roads under the Southern Railway system. At this time, Southern had approximately 10 subsidiaries under its umbrella. This number would grow just 3 years later when they gained control of the 528-mile Class 1 Alabama Great Southern. They then merged 2 subsidiaries into the AGS, the Louisiana Southern and the New Orleans and Northeastern, reducing subsidiaries again. In 1971, the Southern itself was 6,026 miles, not counting subsidiaries. That year saw the merging of Savannah, Atlanta, and Wrightsville and Tenniel into the central of Georgia. They also acquired the 91.7-mile steel hauler Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia Railway, aka TAG. And on December 31st, the Albany Northern was merged into the Georgia Northern. In 1973, the Tennessee Railway was reorganized with help from the Southern Railway and became another of the subsidiaries as the Tennessee Railroad. This was a coal feeder. On January 1st, 1974, the 624-mile Norfolk Southern Railway was purchased by the Southern and left as a fairly independent subsidiary. In 1980, faced with the cooperation of Chessie and Seaboard, which threatened the independent and successful Southern Railway in its 7,600-mile competition, Norfolk and Western, was also independent and successful, the two came together to form holding company Norfolk Southern Corporation to own both Class 1s and their many subsidiaries to maintain a strong competitor in the South against family lines and Chessie. Now here information gets conflicting. June 1st, 1982 is commonly considered the date of the merger of Norfolk and Western and Southern Railways. It's definite that the Wabash merged into the N&W and the original Norfolk Southern into the Southern in 1982. However, the conflict comes when some records say that Norfolk Southern Corporation maintained the Southern and Norfolk and Western as independent subsidiaries until 1990, then merged the N&W into the Southern and renamed that Norfolk Southern Railway. The last merger of their subsidiaries happened on December 31st, 1993, when the Georgia Northern was merged into Georgia Southern and Florida. The final merger came on June 1st, 1999, when 58% of its Conrail and its assets, including 7,200 miles of track, began being operated by Norfolk Southern. Today, Norfolk Southern Railway is owned by NS Corp. And is 19,400 route miles of Class 1 railroad with the largest intermodal network in the nation, with a public stock value of over $51 billion, and remains a major coal hauler despite the reduction of coal use. Georgia Southern and Florida Interstate, AGS, CNO and TP, CFG, TAG, and Tennessee Railroad all remain paper roads under the NS Corp ownership, operated by NS Railway mostly. The GSF, AGS, CNO, TP, and CFG long remain visible on the side of locomotive cabs below the road number, but these have vanished, replaced by NS. The Tennessee Railroad dried up as a coal line and is now operated by the New River Railroad, a tourist line that leases the track from NS. AGS owns 30% of the KCS Meridian Speedway and has its own track, but no locomotives or employees. This completes the mergers of 4 railroads. Next week will be part 2, which will cover the other 4, hopefully. It might be 2. I don't know. That's it.